Oh, no. If you have an original. I hope not. But some of the access students are on. Everybody can just come in and say, no problem. Great. Well, and I'm glad we've got the live stream working. So hi, everybody. I'm Liesl Clark, Director of Climate Action Engagement here at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. Thanks to those of you who have joined us online. We did took us a couple of minutes to get the live streaming working today, but we're glad that it's working. And thanks to everybody who's here in person, because of course you get the food. So you are the winner chicken dinner. So this is the second in our leadership speaker series, and really excited to be welcoming Chairman Dan Scripps from the Michigan Public Service Commission. Before I hand it over to him, I'm going to ask him a few questions, and of course we'll open it up to Q&A from everybody here. Sorry for those of you on the live stream, we have not figured out the technology of Q&A for you yet, but maybe for a future session. But before I start in the conversation with Dan, I wanted to first mention that the next in our speaker series is October 22nd, same time, same place, with Kara Cook, who is State Climate and Energy Chief Strategist, I believe, if I have the title correctly. But just generally a rock star is a good way to think of Kara. So hopefully you can join us for that. And then we'll close it out November 12th with the Michigan Treasurer, Rachel Eubanks, whom I will tease mercilessly about it being a constitutional position and not a governor appointed position, because it always entertains me greatly. So with that, we're going to get into our conversation. So first off, Dan, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You all are lucky too, because he is a Michigan alum, unlike Corey, who was not. So
that's right.
I've done my duty this time. And with Rachel,
Rachel is too, right?
Done my duty. Yeah. Yes. So I'm happy to have done that. So Dan, I was thinking you could just start off by telling us a little bit about your career path.
Sure. It's funny because I have been asked this before, and it always seems to make more sense looking backwards than it did at any step along the way. And but I went to U of M Law School, graduated in 2005, met my wife actually working in the law library.
Gonna skip Alma?
Well, all right. So I went to Alma College and graduated with a degree in political science. Between college and law school, I did a number of political campaigns here and also spent some time in Scotland, where I worked on the first campaigns for the new Scottish Parliament that was first elected in 1999, and then came back after a couple of those adventures and enrolled at the law school here. Did some private practice and then ran for a seat in the state House of Representatives. I live in Liesl County, which for those of you who are from Michigan, you probably know where it is. If you're not, it's sort of up here near Traverse City. And the district that I represented went from Liesl County down 4 counties to Ludington. And so about 100 miles, a little bit more along the lakeshore. Lost in 2006, but won a seat in 2008 and served 1 term in the Michigan House. Lost my reelection in 2010, went back to the practice of law in DC, and then came back upon an invitation from you, I think, to help lead a new clean energy business trade association in Michigan, and then do some national work as well. And so it's different pieces that have sort of fit together along the way. And then when the governor was elected, Rachel actually had been a member of the Public Service Commission and was appointed treasurer. And so there was an early opening on the Public Service Commission. It was something that I had been sort of interested in for a number of years, and was fortunate enough, thanks to some folks on the inside pulling for me, to ultimately be appointed. That was in February of 2019, and I was named chair in June of 2020.
So what drew you to working on climate and clean energy issues?
Sure. It's something, again, it wasn't something where I didn't come out of law school with an environmental law background. It was sort of general, but when I started working, I was working at a firm in DC, sort of gravitated towards the environmental law area, in part just for happenstance, but just became more interested in it. And a lot of the environmental permitting that I was doing was tied to energy assets, including transmission towers and some other things. When I was elected to the state house, actually, when I ran for the first time for the state house, I got a questionnaire from one of the interest groups, I can't even remember which one, asking if I would support a renewable portfolio standard. And I had literally never heard of renewable
This would
portfolio
have been
standard.
06 then?
Yeah. And so I called the group and asked what it was, and they gave me a briefing. And I said, "Well, that sounds like good policy. Is my opponent on board?" And they said, "No, he is opposed." I said, "All right, you can put me down as a yes." And so that was in some ways sort of stumbling into it. And then when I did get elected, the district that I represented had a little bit of everything from an energy perspective. So the person who represents that area has traditionally been on the energy committee, in part because it's got the Ludington pumped hydro facility. It's I think the second largest in the US. It's massive, 6 turbines. It's about 2,000 megawatts. So 2 full-scale nuclear plants. It had the first wind project in Michigan. It had some drilling for oil and gas, just sort of a whole range of different things, some run-of-the-river hydro projects, and sort of that background serving the district and then getting engaged on the committee. And it was at a time where you were in the administration under then Governor Granholm, where the administration was doing a lot of work in that area. And so being sort of a legislative partner to some of the work that was happening in the governor's office was just a great opportunity to sort of jump in and learn the issue areas. Coming out, when I went back to the practice of law, I knew that I wanted to do more energy work. And it was in the sort of Obama era where there was an awful lot of stimulus money flowing into energy projects. And so having a chance to work on some of those from a legal perspective, but the ultimate project development plans, and then sort of going from there. And sorry, during that time as well, some of the pro bono efforts were around helping states set up green banks. So the first one of those was in Connecticut, and helping to write the statutory language, having been a legislator, but also sort of the legal frameworks around how state green banks would operate. And some of those same people now have set up the National Green Bank under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so it's interesting to see how some of these things sort of come full circle, and each step made sense in terms of the next step, but it wasn't ever sort of, I'm plotting out a path to become chair of the Michigan Public Service Commission.
And you've done a lot in the financing space, including time on the banking committee. Can you talk a little bit about how financing has woven through your background?
Sure, that's again unexpected. As a sort of political science major who also studied English, sort of going into banking was not something that I had foreseen. But it really sort of, particularly with the opportunities around setting up the Connecticut Green Bank, sort of provided an opportunity. And a lot of the people who were working on that were really focused on how do you set up state structures that are sort of quasi-public, but that ultimately help to animate private markets. And a realization that even in the Obama stimulus days, even with the amount of money that the federal government has invested, it really takes private capital to sort of achieve things at the scale that's necessary in terms of the threats that climate change sort of creates, but also the opportunities that it creates in terms of what a response might look like. And so if you can use the limited public dollars that you have to ultimately de-risk and animate private markets, then you sort of move from billions into trillions and are able to sort of move at that scale. And so that was, I think, really eye-opening for me, and seeing some of what has happened since in the creation of the New York Green Bank and some of the projects around infrastructure banking in California. And then as this has taken off and become sort of a national focus of the more recent federal actions, and the way that the national funds are partnering with both sort of public funds and non-for-profit entities across the country has been really interesting.
So you've worked quite a bit in both the public sphere and the private sphere. I think a lot of times our students are thinking about, like, where am I a good fit? NGO world as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the differences are and what you've experienced in your career path?
Sure, yeah, and it really is sort of private sector, public sector, and the not-for-profit NGO space. And they all, I think, have their pluses and drawbacks. So one of the things that's really interesting being in the private sector and working sort of as a lawyer at a big firm, but also with the entities that we were representing, is that they're very profit focused. And so how do you get from sort of how do you sort of wrangle the capital that's needed, and how do you put that around a development plan, and then ultimately how do you move towards project development? And that sort of intensity of focus can be really helpful in terms of you don't waste a lot of time sort of chasing things that aren't ultimately core to how you make money. And the downside is you don't spend a lot of time chasing things that might be interesting, but ultimately don't result in dollars. But that has been, I think, really helpful training. But it also, again, it's how I think it's ultimately private industry that is necessary to achieve the sort of level of project deployment that we're going to need at scale. So, but in the public sector, you spend a lot more time focused on sort of policy questions. How do you set the right policy and regulatory frameworks that ultimately sort of lead to the results that the legislature wants to see and that ultimately you're responsible for? And that's been really, really interesting in terms of that you're not necessarily putting capital at risk, but it's sort of the core focus of how do you set up the right framework that then sort of unlocks people to go do the things that you hope that they do, or puts limitations on them doing the things that you hope that they don't do. And there's definitely a little bit of both. And then in sort of the nonprofit advocacy and philanthropic space, it's really interesting because you can ask bigger questions. You can push for things that ultimately are probably beyond what you can achieve in the moment, but ultimately sort of help to create sort of new realities that I think even in the public space, it's difficult to do sometimes, that you're sort of limited by sort of what the statute is in front of you, or what emergency you're currently facing. You know a little bit about that as well. And so less time to sort of rethink, like, is this the way that it should be? And I think that in the philanthropic space and in the nonprofit space, there is a little more room for that. The downside there is sometimes you can get lost in that, and that there's sort of a detachment from how to actually move things in practice, how to ultimately achieve things. Not always, but sometimes. And sometimes there's a sense within sort of nonprofit organizations that the mission should be enough. And there's any number of examples of nonprofit organizations who I think just tend to be a little sloppier from HR roles, and it's, I think, inherent in that you sort of assume good intentions, but there can be a downside to that too. So I've enjoyed sort of any number of roles in each of those three spaces, but I think going in eyes wide open that there are sort of pluses and minuses to each of it.
Is there advice that you would give to yourself looking backwards right now, either undergrad or graduate, that, comes out of the experiences that you've had in all those different areas?
Yeah, so you gave me these questions ahead of time, and this is the one.
I haven't gone into the questions that he doesn't have. Those are coming.
But this was the one that I probably spent the most time sort of thinking about. And so I'll tell a couple embarrassing stories. They're not actually that embarrassing.
We are live streaming and recording.
Yes. I don't say anything, assuming that it's not going to get picked up at this point. But I think spending more time sort of challenging assumptions. And so I mentioned I have a political science background. I worked on campaigns. I knew that I wanted to go into politics at some point. I didn't know that I would run for office as soon as I did. And I think that I now have that out of my system. But I think one of the things that sort of colored in going through college in particular was sort of wanting to have the right answer and not necessarily being comfortable with struggling to sort of get there. And so I graduated from Alma in 1998. I entered the fall that the Republicans took over Congress for the first time in however many years, in 1994, part
40.
of the Newt Gingrich contract with America. Oh, is that right? Okay. That's right. You were a page. So my senior thesis was on, and we had done this sort of capstone course, reading a whole bunch of management texts and then some texts on leadership. And I sort of posed the question in my thesis whether sort of the contract with America was ultimately a sort of management document or a leadership document. And I think I got it exactly wrong. So I had said, no, this is a management document and it doesn't exhibit sort of actual leadership. And I think the reason that I got it wrong is that I had in my mind as a political science student that leadership good, management something probably over at the B school bad. And so how could this document that I was largely opposed to sort of be an example of leadership if leadership is good? And I think I got it exactly wrong. It is in many ways sort of a radical approach to governance, but in radicalism, that is sort of staking out and saying this is the direction that we're going, as opposed to essentially what President Clinton was doing at that time was trying to manage the federal government in a way that that sort of harness the federal bureaucracy in order to do good things. And so, but it was, I think I got lazy at the beginning and then sort of never questioned it along the way. And I think if there's a place that I've grown over the course of my career, it's to try and get more comfortable not knowing the answer at the beginning and wrestling with what that might look like along the way. And I think, I mean, I can sort of go back and tell you all the decisions I think I've gotten wrong in my current job too, but that it has resulted in better decisions because it's not sort of presupposing the answer at the beginning and trying to justify it, but sort of actually looking at the question, wrestling with the question, the evidence, and trying to figure out along the way what is the right answer. So I wish I had known that sooner. That's not actually that embarrassing, but
That wasn't that
I know.
embarrassing.
Let's heat it up, right? Yeah, no.
It's not embarrassing, but that's okay. Great. So we set this up as a sustainability leadership speaker series, and I'm interested in particular in decision making that you do and that Rachel does in this space, because I think it's a little bit different than what Kara and Corey do. However, Corey and I had a really interesting conversation about the difference between climate issues and sustainability issues. But I was wondering, how do you think about sustainability from a decision making lens in the seat that you sit in?
Yeah. It's interesting because we often talk about being creatures of statute, that the Public Service Commission was established as the Michigan Railroad Commission back in 1873. So last year we celebrated 150 years of regulation. I think we were the only ones to celebrate that. We have coffee cups and everything. We're big dorks at the commission. But it's and we say that we're creatures of statute. Every power that we have is defined by statute. We have no common law powers. And yet every decision that we make has particularly in the energy space, pretty fundamental impacts on how we use energy and the emissions and other environmental considerations that go along with that. How we, the level of recovery we allow for sort of coal ash disposal, for example. We're having a really interesting conversation in the state of Michigan right now around some of our hydro dams. So sorry if this is triggering. We had an incident in 2000 where 3 dams on the Tittabawassee River up
2020.
20, what did I say?
4 dams.
2000?
Do you want me to tell the story?
Yeah, you tell us. So 4 dams in 2020. Did I say 2000? Oh yeah, sorry. 2020, height of COVID. It was May 2020, May 7th.
May 19th to be
Okay.
exact.
And-
Tattooed in my brain.
And people like literally had to be evacuated from their homes and moved into sort of gyms because their homes were being threatened in the middle of COVID, like in the worst. And it was really awful. And it raised the question of sort of what do we do about these hydro facilities, which are sort of have been there for 100 years, in many ways are good sources of carbon-free electricity, but they're also really expensive, and they're particularly expensive if you actually care about keeping them safe and not flooding downtown Midland. And so this is a question that Consumers Energy, our second largest utility in particular, is wrestling with, because you've got I mean, from our perspective, like we should compensate for the value of the power, but the value of the power is much less than the cost of running those dams. And at the same time, you've got a number of people who either live around the impoundments or who use them for recreational purposes, fishing and boating and everything else, who derive a great deal of value from that. In some ways, a great deal of their property value is tied to that, as we've seen in Midland. And yet sort of unclear sort of whether they are sort of putting in for the value above the sort of value from a power perspective. And I think there are all sorts of sustainability questions in that, because it's ultimately sort of, if we decide that, no, we're going to cap this at the same value that we would pay for sort of a solar project in a field, because it's just the electricity that we care about, those dams are overnight uneconomic. And then what do you do? Because the cost of removing them might be exactly the right thing from like a fisheries standpoint, but that could be hundreds of millions of dollars as well. And so it's one of these things where we're not climate regulators, we're not environmental regulators, we're sort of traditionally economic regulators at the commission. And yet virtually every decision that we have has pretty significant impacts on climate considerations and the sort of mix of power generation sources and efforts around decarbonizing the power sector, and then ultimately the sectors that could be served by electricity, like transportation, home heating, industrial processes that currently rely on fossil fuels. And then a number of other sort of sustainability issues as well, including fisheries and everything else. And yet that's not the level of expertise that you find in the building, that we have really good engineers and accountants and auditors, but we don't have a lot of people who graduated from C's. Maybe we should have some more.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
But that was exactly what I was thinking while I was listening to you talk, is we've had a lot of conversations here about the need for interdisciplinary backgrounds, with one foot solidly, for example, in one discipline. So maybe it's engineering, maybe it's finance, maybe it's law, maybe it's policy, like whatever it is, right? Yeah. Land use, planning, right? But you need to have a foot solidly in one place, but also be able to see that interdisciplinary picture. So, and that is what the C's people bring to the table for sure. Before I want to dive in, you've brought up a ton of topics that I want to come back and loop back to, but before I do that, I'm going to make sure you get the questions on the list. So what accomplishments are you most proud of? Yeah, I know, I can tell that you've prepared, and I hate to not ask people the questions they're prepared for.
You wouldn't know, actually, from the rambling answers. What accomplishment? So I will say the thing that I'm most, so I was going to say proud of, I'm reminded by my Scottish friends that pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. But
Nipple sitting on your shoulder?
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think it would be sort of family and friends and the sort of the relationships that really is, in many ways, the things that I'm most proud of. Professionally, I think that carries over as well. That you asked sort of what I was drawn to in this work. I think it's the opportunity to do impactful work at scale. And the thing that I'd add to that in terms of the culture at the commission is to do it with just really great people. And I've been really blessed by the colleagues that I've had in state government and at the commission in particular, just being sort of wonderful human beings. And I had a former colleague, and we would close calls telling each other that we loved each other, like the 3 of us. It's not something I've ever experienced in my life. But to do hard but impactful work, and to do it in a way that I think goes well beyond Michigan, but even Michigan, sort of the 10 million people counting on us to do this right, and to do it with just wonderful people that you genuinely love is an amazing thing. Beyond that, I think the 2 things in my current role that I'm sort of focused on, the role that I played, and Carol will talk about this next time more in terms of the energy legislation that was enacted at the end of last year. I can tell you 1,000 ways that it's not perfect, but ultimately moving towards 100% clean energy is defined by statute, 60% renewables by 2035, 50% by 2030, 2.5 gigawatt energy storage target that's the largest in the Midwest, one of the largest, the first in the Midwest, one of the largest in the country, increasing distributed generation from 1% to 10% of total load, building on some of the best energy waste reduction or energy efficiency programs in the country, but adding sort of to them to make them stronger still, with a particular focus on bringing to the table folks who have too often been left out of the conversation from environmental justice communities, and the considerations around environmental justice and equity and climate that I think are increasingly central to this work. It is, I think, a broad-based, workable, and I think that might be the most important piece, and ambitious piece of legislation. And I say workable because it's not perfect. It's not everything that climate advocates wanted, but I say as the agency that's largely trusted with implementing it, I see how we get from what's on the sort of page from the bill writers to what that looks like in terms of our decisions and the impact that it makes on our power sector and ultimately the economy more broadly. And there are sort of clear paths that also, I think, reflect important realities around making sure that we can keep the lights on, making sure that we're not spiking bills, dealing with the realities of global supply chains that sometimes are a little messier than we'd like them to be. And I think it provides a balance and then an implementation path that I think is actually achievable in a way that sometimes ambitious climate legislation is not. And then I also spend about half my time working on regional grid issues, and entity that covers this part of the country is called MISO, the Mid-Continent Interdependent System Operator. It covers from Saskatchewan down to essentially parts of Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi. And they put together the largest ever package of transmission infrastructure. So the first tranche of it was $10.3 billion. The next tranche is $21 billion. Just to put that in perspective, the largest previous ever sort of bulk transmission portfolio was about $6 billion. So they doubled it and then they doubled it again. And I played a role in the really wonky area of how you allocate the costs associated with those projects and who should pay and how they should pay and how they get billed. And it's sort of in the minutia, but I think in energy in particular, details matter a lot. And so we talk about broad concepts and the impact and everything else, but then you get into like how the dollars flow, and often you need to figure that out before people will have enough confidence that they won't pay too much, that they're willing to engage in the actual planning of the projects. And so working with a pretty broad group of interested parties on something that, again, not perfect, and I can detail all the ways that I would prefer it to be better, but ultimately led to sort of consensus and approval by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on how that sort of $32 billion should ultimately flow to customers to build the transmission that we need to responsibly manage the energy transition and keep the lights on.
Negotiating in practice. We have a lot of negotiating folks in here, in particular Steve Yaffe, who teaches an awesome class on negotiating. So,
super important.
yep, super important. So what do you just described what your accomplishments and what you're feeling good about. What are you looking forward to in the next 6 months?
Yeah, so the legislation that was implemented took effect for the most part in February of this year, but there's just a whole lot of work streams. And so we'll start seeing some of the first integrated resource plans, which are the long-term plans filed by utilities and how they meet their energy needs over the next 15 plus years. Those will be filed in the next year, and they will start incorporating the requirements to get to 100% clean energy by 2040 and 80% clean energy by 2035. And so sort of finishing the work around guidance ahead of those filings and seeing some of those first filings on how do you actually get there from where you are today. And it's not that we're standing still. I think one of the criticisms that was levied at the legislation is that it wasn't ambitious enough because a lot of this was already baked into the utility plans. And this was just incremental progress. I take that as like an endorsement that we're sort of on the right path, but it's another step up in terms of ambition. But finishing that, and then the one piece that didn't take effect, thankfully, in February is around renewable siting. And so sorry, I keep looking over at Sarah Mills because she's been absolutely critical to the discussions that led up to it. I don't think she loved every piece of the legislation, but has been really instrumental in making it work in a way that I think tries to find a balance between communities wanting to have a say in what their community looks like and private landowners and developers who want to see some of this development move forward. That piece of legislation takes effect in November. And there's a process where, with a couple of exceptions, you have to still start at the local level. And so I don't think we'll start seeing application. We might see a few in November, but I don't think we'll start really seeing applications until sort of March-ish, and trying to get the final guidance ahead of that, which we'll issue this week, and building on some of the staff report and the different pieces that have been added to that conversation. It's not the first time we've done land use planning, but it's probably the first time that we've done it in this sort of microscope environment. You were talking about sort of computer labs. I remember the old fishbowl across the street, and sort of feels like that sometimes.
So I want to loop back to a couple of things that you mentioned. The first is I want to spend a minute on emergencies, because I don't think everybody understands what emergencies look like from the state government perspective. And obviously we're thinking about this because of Milton being a category 4, category 5, hitting areas that just were hit by Helene. I heard a story on the way in about a family that evacuated from North Carolina to be with their family down in Tampa. and they're just like reeling right now, trying to figure out what happens. But I think emergencies look really interesting from within state government. So I was wondering if you could talk about, what that looks like from your perspective. Yeah, because it's a lot harder than it looks.
Yeah. So um, I in late January 2019, I was sitting at an airport bar on my way to Minneapolis for a work conference. I was doing clean energy philanthropy at the time, right before being appointed. And I got a text, and anybody who was in Michigan at that time got the same text. It was from our state police asking all of us to turn our thermostats down to 55 degrees in order to preserve the gas system. And it was in the wake of it was in the midst of a polar vortex, the sort of week-long cold weather event. And during those events, often sort of the worst things happened at the worst times, and it's not necessarily a coincidence. So we have in Michigan a huge amount of underground natural gas storage, and we have typically bought gas when it's cheap and put it underground, and then we take it back out when gas is more expensive. And so it provides an economic hedge for customers. And it also provides, more recently, we've seen that it provides sort of greater security even when there are disruptions on the broader gas system, except when the compressor that you need to pull the gas out from underground is running 24/7 and ultimately explodes, which it did on this particular day. And we came really, really close to shutting down 1 million plus people in the state. I was not on the commission at this point. This was literally the week that I got appointed. But shutting down 1 million people and their access to gas when the temperature outside was as cold as it's been in the last 5 years. And when that happens, you have to turn every single customer off at their residence, at their premises, get the system back to where it functions, and then go relight every single pilot light. And so think about sort of the amount of time that takes, even with sort of every person in large utility crews. And so it was, I think, eye-opening. It was ultimately a success story. The system held, people responded, and both the gas system and the electricity system ultimately went forward without disruption. But it was eye-opening, and so I got appointed that week. A really fun time to join the commission. And the first 7 or 8 months of that year, we sort of worked through a comprehensive statewide energy assessment that the governor had directed us to do in the wake of that experience. But there have also been the dam issues that I'll let you tell that story. But it's often sort of the sort of role of critical infrastructure and needing it to work is challenging, and that can be anything from an event like that to just a major ice storm. But the storms that we had in February of 2023, I keep backdating myself by 20 years, that hit Ann Arbor particularly hard. There was about a ½ inch of ice on distribution lines. And what I was told by the utilities is that's the equivalent of hanging a baby grand piano on each segment of line, the weight equivalent. And so we had more than 1 million people lose power during that time, and some for more than a week. And often it was not the first time they had lost power. And then we got another storm a couple weeks later where we had tornadoes in March, and some of those same people went right back out, and often for multiple days. And so that really sort of the human suffering component of that really crystallized, like there's not a lot you can do in the day, but boy, does it get your attention in terms of the longer term improvements that are needed in the system. And that I'll say that the biggest frustration of the job is that it takes a long time with systems as large and interconnected as the electric and natural gas systems are to sort of see system-wide improvement at a level that ultimately people feel. And so we can say, oh, this particular circuit's performing better, but overall it takes time and investment and patience, and I don't have a lot of patience sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, emergencies are just something else. And when you think about the fact that, part of the reason Helene was so bad was because the ground was already saturated. That's certainly something that we've seen in Michigan over and over, like the rainstorms in 2021 in Detroit, and then of course the dam in 2020 in mid-Michigan. So It's a real challenge. And so that gets us to the ways that mitigation and adaptation are kind of twirled up within each other. And I've been thinking a lot about this topic for the last couple of years because being in an academic world, I see the academic side of the house more neatly splitting up adaptation and mitigation in a way that policymakers don't. Policymakers see them much more intertwined and see adaptation as more connected into some of the programs that are existing and mitigation being more on the way we're transitioning side. But I was wondering to what extent you think about adaptation and mitigation. Obviously, you did a lot in the nonprofit world, in the philanthropy world before coming to state government, but how do you think about that over time? And potentially, if you do think about it in the chair role, how do you think about it at MPSC?
Yeah, I might give a couple of examples. So one of the criticisms, and I think it's a valid criticism of the legislation that was enacted last year, is that it was all focused on mitigation and almost nothing focused on adaptation. And the way that we often talk about adaptation is resilience and the reliability of the underlying systems. And we've got real challenges around reliability and resilience, particularly on the electric distribution system, where we have more outages, but particularly they last longer and more people are hit with repeated outages over the course of the year. It's shocking the number of times that some people experience sort of more than momentary outages over the course of the year where they don't reset their answering machines and things like that, because it's just not, it'll happen again next week. One of the things we at the commission have tried to do, and I think it does link them a little bit, is in how we approach the distribution plans. What we've created, we're trying to better align how the utilities make money with the results that customers see, particularly around the performance of the distribution system. And the way that we've sort of characterized it and thought about it is this reliability plus framework. And the reliability piece and resilience around getting people restored faster, having them not be out as often, I think is very much sort of tied to adaptation, that the ability to sort of, when events hit, to bounce back faster. But the plus part is, how do we think about the role of the distribution system in actually some of the mitigation strategies, including distributed energy resources like generation, the adoption of electric vehicles and other things that can ultimately play a meaningful role in reducing the amount of greenhouse gases. And that is also tied to sort of a more modern distribution system than the way that we've traditionally thought of the distribution system. So there's both sort of an immediate adaptation piece and then a longer term mitigation strategy that are both part of getting more out of the distribution system that we have. I guess the other example the long range transmission projects that MISO undertook, it unlocks, I should know the numbers, but it's something like 50 gigawatts of new renewable generation. But it's also really, really important from a resilience standpoint in terms of avoiding, because Rob Gramlich's an energy consultant, and his phrase that I love is that we need a grid that's bigger than the weather, particularly as we are more reliant on renewable resources that are intermittent by nature. And so, but if you can sort of follow, if your grid is big enough that you can follow the sun and follow wind patterns, and ultimately have it so that even if you're disrupted because of Helene or other things, that you're intertied in a way that can get you power from other places, that provides real resilience benefits in the wake of extreme weather. And that's not how we've planned the grid. We've planned the grid around, to some extent, just sort of baseline reliability, and then more recently, economic opportunities of like lower cost, fuel-less wind to start, and increasingly solar. And you see that sort of those patterns, we assume that we're going to move wind energy from the plains into the load centers in the east of the footprint, but in the flows would basically be west to east. And you see that in emergency situations, the power flows on those same lines are essentially exactly the opposite. And so the same sort of metal in the ground plays very different roles from like a mitigation standpoint in how they usually function, and then in extreme weather events and emergency events from an adaptation event in preserving the resilience of the system and bouncing back faster when it's disrupted. And the last thing that I'll say is one of the biggest challenges in doing all of this is how you think about sort of the immediate and pressing need to transform our energy systems, and then also the role that those systems, including those that are fueled by natural or by fossil fuels, play in maintaining reliability. And that we see that on the natural gas system, where we have approved pipeline projects needed to create redundancy in a gas system, even while there are a lot of people sort of questioning what is the future of the gas system. And we've done it as well in terms of some of the projects that we've approved that sort of maintain a role for fossil fuels in electricity generation, even as there are big questions. And some of it is like, well, we need this for resilience, knowing that there's a downside from the mitigation standpoint, but the immediate option, like the immediate menu of options, isn't as robust. And how do we get from here to there? And I'll say those are probably the questions that keep me up most at night, is just the trade-off between doing something that may have some downsides from a mitigation standpoint in the near term, but are necessary in terms of how we use the energy system, at least today.
Those are definitely the toughest issues as a regulator, for sure. So we know that lots of students here are interested in what they do next, which is you've spoken to a lot in sharing a bit about your career. What's going on immediately? We have some real needs for workforce in the state of Michigan. Can you talk a little bit what the commission needs and what the needs are broadly?
Yeah, so I'll say both. From the commission standpoint, so we're an agency of about 200 people. We received, as part of implementing the new clean energy laws, 28 additional positions, so about 15% increase in the total number of employees that we have at the commission. And we are actively hiring for those roles, some of which have been filled, some of which are open today, and for those who are graduating soon, including at the end of the academic year, I think we'll still have positions open in April and May of next year. So there are a lot of opportunities, more than we usually have. We often will post sort of one position. Now it feels like we're posting 5 positions at a time. And so it's been interesting. And about a third of the people who work at the commission joined since COVID, have never sort of been in a traditional, we did an all staff meeting recently and actually pulled the numbers, but both in terms of people who responded. And so it was very much a 8 to 5 in-person organization. And over the course of a weekend, we, like a lot of places, shifted, and we haven't shifted back. A lot of places have more in-person requirements. And for the most part, we continue to allow our people to work from wherever they want to in Michigan. So if you're a state employee, you have to be located in Michigan. But we've seen people move to Northeast Michigan, the Alpine area. We've seen them move to the UP. And there's a benefit, I think, to having not everybody concentrated in Lansing, particularly when you're seeing sort of weather disruptions, that you actually have people who are out there living this in real time, and you get sort of a better sense of what's going on around the state just through the interaction. So but I will also say that I think Michigan was ranked #1 in the Midwest recently for clean energy jobs and clean energy job growth. We've seen that from everything from sort of the vehicle space and advanced transportation, and there are a number of battery firms that are locating in Michigan. There are any number of opportunities with utilities or with project developers, and we regularly are having our people poached, which is something we try and guard against. We want it to be a robust alumni network, and we never want to hold people back from, but it's also the experience that you get at the commission often makes you super valuable to a lot of people in this space as well. And that's ultimately a good thing for the individuals and for us and for the ecosystem. But there are a lot of opportunities in this space in Michigan right now, both in the public and private sectors.
Great. All right. I'm going to give you lightning round questions while everybody thinks about the questions that they have for Dan, because I know there are many. So back to careers to start off. First job.
So,
Here's
so my
lightning.
first paying job was at McDonald's, but I worked for my grandpa, who was in the carpet business his whole life. And then in retirement, bought a trailer and made rugs that go in the back of bowling alleys to cushion pins. And so he would take carpet and cut them into these squares and then go sell them to bowling alleys. And so that was fun working with my grandpa.
Favorite place?
I'm from Michigan, born and raised, and I love water, and I have always been drawn to islands and peninsulas and places that are surrounded. So that can be anything from where I live in Liesl County to places in Scotland that I had the chance to visit, to islands in the Caribbean. But I am very much wanting to be close to water, and so islands and peninsulas tend to speak to me.
Something you've read lately that you want to share with everybody? I'm just going read with you because I
Yeah.
know you read so many books.
So, well, that used to be true. So the best advice that I got upon taking this job, I reached out to some other folks who had done this job, and one said, make sure you sign up for the vision plan. And I was like, I've never had glasses. I don't need glasses. And less than a year later, every time I go back, it's a step up in prescription. The other thing is that I used to read probably a book a week, and that's a lot less common today. But the two that I've read recently that I've really enjoyed. So somehow in my educational career, I never read To Kill a Mockingbird. And my 14-year-old son is currently reading it as a freshman in high school, and I read it with him. And it's as good as the writing's fabulous, the themes are wonderful, and the chance to sort of discover it with him has been really great. The other one is it's the 50th year of Robert Caro's The Power Broker, about Bob Moses. And I sort of fell in love with planning. This isn't because Sarah's in the room. When I was at law school, I sort of got bored with law school and sort of read The Death and Life of Great American Cities and a number of other things around urban planning, and just got sort of fascinated by it, and seeing sort of how Robert Moses transformed New York in ways both good and bad, but at scale it's just a fascinating book. And I think I'm both reading it and listening to it, and the audiobook version is 66 hours. I can't remember how many pages are in it, but I've got a ways to go yet. So,
Well, you got a lot of drive time. All right. What never fails to make you laugh?
You, Liesl.
Oh.
No, I've got a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old, and particularly the 10-year-old is just hilarious, and I have no idea what's going to come out of his mouth.
So funny. Like, he literally does stand up.
Yeah. So anyway, I laugh a lot.
Awesome. All right. What questions do you all have ready to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here with us today. I've really enjoyed you sharing your perspectives, and I have plenty of questions, but I'll limit it now to sort of one of the constant push-pulls of sort of transitioning the electric grid and digitizing more things and adding electrification broadly is that as you try and scale up the adoption of renewables, you're also trying to meet new demand.
Mm-hmm.
How is the commission thinking about navigating that really challenging dynamic?
Yeah, it's a great question. Without great answers. There's an active conversation right now in the legislature around data centers, and trying to sort of make Michigan more attractive to data centers. And there are some real concerns around what that does to the energy laws that we enacted last year. And there's a couple thoughts around it. I think it is a challenge. I mean, one of the luxuries that we've had in recent years is that we've been able to do this transformation in era of relatively flat load growth. In fact, historically flat load growth, which meant that you had a little more buffer as you sort of were taking plants offline. You still had some reserve margins, but we've gotten really good, in part because of the RTOs, in part because we've sort of unwound from some of the excess capacity we've had on the system. But we got to that point essentially as we got to potentially a hockey stick in terms of demand. And I think there are some really big questions around how you sort of move forward. It's one of the reasons that I ultimately think that the framework in how Michigan is approaching this is the right one. So we have sort of a belt and suspenders approach around planning that uses the integrated resource plans from electric utilities, and then also and those look out sort of 15 years, and then also requires every electric provider in Michigan show what their anticipated load is 4 years from now. And so we call this the capacity demonstration process, and then demonstrate that they've got sufficient capacity. And it's 4 years. This is both of those were added in 2016. And the reason is in 4 years, you probably could build new generation to come online. So I think you get both a longer term sense and a medium term sense. And then even within the ambition within the energy laws, we have they still go through the integrated resource planning process. And I think that's really important because through the last consumers IRP, for example, we approved the retirement of their last remaining coal plants. So 3 coal units in the Holland Grand Haven area. But we also brought in an existing gas generator that was serving in PJM and moved over to MISO. And we look at it from a zonal sort of lower Michigan standpoint and then a company specific standpoint. And there are a number of checks to make sure like, okay, are we managing this responsibly? And I think having that framework be the same framework that we use in sort of moving forward, including, and people hate it when I talk about this, but some of the places where we can tap the brakes. And so if it's going to lead to an affordability crisis, if it's ultimately going to threaten resource adequacy, sort of the total amount of energy or some voltage and sort of more localized concerns around reliability, or if there are supply chain issues, we can extend compliance deadlines. And to me, that says we're still going to get there, but if it takes a little longer to get to that level of ambition in order to keep prices affordable and maintain system reliability, that's okay. But I still think it's good. That doesn't mean we throw out the requirements or that we sort of provide a full off ramp or sort of that you no longer have to comply. It's just we're going to try and work with sort of the realities on the system to make that happen. And I think that gives me some comfort as we look at data centers, but there's also some really significant economic development projects and just sort of ballpark, a data center could add sort of 2,500 megawatts to 5,000 megawatts in any one location. Some of these bigger economic development projects are sort of at the lower end of that, but 2,500 megawatts. The largest single site user in the Lower Peninsula is the Hemlock Semiconductor facility near Saginaw, which is 400 megawatts. So you're talking about something that's 6 to 10 times as large as the largest facility in Michigan, just sort of being dropped in, and data centers want to be there in 2 years. And so there are a lot of things to work through, but I ultimately think a framework that sort of preserves some flexibility around the realities of the system, including affordability realities, but doesn't step back from sort of the level of ambition necessary to tackle our role in addressing climate change issues is the right way to do it. So you can write things in stone, but you're either going to have to sort of go back and change them, or you're going to crash the system. And I don't think either is ultimately the sort of a responsible result, but something that sort of bakes in that flexibility and allows us to sort of say, okay, we still need to get there. Maybe we need an extra year is a better approach.
So some resiliency so you can be adaptable.
Yeah. Key themes, right?
Questions? Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking today. My name is Andrew, I'm first year He's also from around Lake Michigan. I'm from the Holland area, so excellent connection to Great Lake. Wanted to ask a question that relates to a project that Liesl and Sarah both gave some input on, actually, which is the project I did this past summer with Consumers Energy, thinking about how they respond to these new justice and equity metrics that we're requiring to report on. Their initial approach was to, I'm really glad they made this a student project, was to have us conduct interviews, kind of provide some leading research on what energy justice and energy equity is, really get a good sense of how people are experiencing energy in their daily lives across the state and things that are priorities for them. My question for you is if you want to expand a little bit more on your approach to creating these justice and equity metrics that you're having consumers and DTE report on, and what you hope to see as a result from these being implemented and tracked better in regards to energy and environmental justice.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. It's something we spent a lot of time on recently, and it's something that I think across the board regulators, this is something relatively new. And so I'm not sure that anybody has perfect answers, but some of what we've done, we want additional reporting on any number of things, including reliability, particularly around reliability metrics, but to be done on a census tract basis, on a zip code basis, and on a circuit basis. So circuit sort of is often how utility, it's the easiest thing. It's sort of how their system's constructed, and that, but then sort of, okay, so then take it to a zip code basis, and sometimes circuits, you know, there are multiple circuits within the zip code. Sometimes the circuit serves two different zip codes, but that gives us a better sense based on sort of communities. And then getting down to the census tract level allows us to use a lot of outside data on top of it in terms of income levels, in terms of racial demographics and other things, and really trying to get a sense of how the system looks different in different places and for different people. So that has been, I think we're still wrestling with exactly how we use the data, but the first step was to get it in a couple of different layers that then can be manipulated to give a better sense of what the system looks like. My expectation, which I have been found is not entirely true, but there are elements of truth. But my guess was that we would see some of the same sort of systemic injustices that we see across society in terms of level of performance, number of outages, duration of outages, number of repeated outages based on sort of low income populations and populations with higher percentages of racial minorities. That hasn't been as clean as I would have expected, which is sort of good. But I think getting the data gives us a starting point for then what are you going to do with it? The second piece is really around affordability. And I think there is an affordability crisis among certain populations. So it's something that for a lot of people, their electric bill is just something they pay and they grumble when it goes up, but it's not. But if you're making 100% of federal poverty level or below, it can be 25% of your income. And that is a much different reality than if you're sort of relatively well off and it's just one of the expenses. And it really does force those awful choices of, are you going to pay for your electric bill, keep the lights on, or are you going to pay for medicine? Are you going to food? Sort of what doesn't make the cut this time? I think during COVID, we had to sharpen our pencils a lot, and a lot of jurisdictions sort of put in place moratoriums, and for better or worse, we didn't. And part of the reason that we didn't is in the 2009 and 10 timeframe, when the rest of the nation's economy struggled, but Michigan had been dealing with that for a decade at that point. We had a number of moratoria in place that ultimately people could never dig out of. And it's sort of like, it helped in the moment, but it created sort of a decade of trying to unwind that. And so we said, okay, I'm not sure that that's the best strategy, but if we're not going to have a moratorium in place during COVID, we've got to get a lot better at delivering assistance and I think we did. So we were paying off using federal dollars, bills sort of without customers even knowing, but because we could sort of looking at data say, this person's always paid their bill and now they've missed 2 payments. What if we sort of using this federal money and a 25% match from the utility said, okay, we're just going to sort of bring them back to, and what we found is the number of people falling behind and the total amount of arrearages or overdue bills was much, much less. In fact, it got better during the pandemic at a time that a lot of other states were falling off. And I think we've tried to continue that approach on assistance to things like the credits that utilities offer. There's an ongoing legislative discussion about how to streamline and better connect some of the assistance provisions. And then we also have, for both DT and consumers, percentage of income pilot programs saying that we're going to cap at 6% of income the amount that you pay. And that we're still working through some of that, but I think that is one way of recognizing the affordability challenges. And then the last thing is, I think well, again, not perfect, the legislation does a lot of things around environmental justice communities that we have never seen before. So it requires environmental justice considerations as part of which peaker plants might a utility retire, if they're going to add a plant, sort of whether it's in an environmental justice community. For the funds that are made available to participate in our cases, we've got an intervener compensation fund that's separately administered, but provides grants to nonprofit organizations. They need to prioritize communities with high energy burdens and communities representing environmental justice communities in the allocation of those grants for residential customers. So there's a number of pieces that are sort of baked in that I think recognize the reality that not all customers experience the system in the same way. And a lot of the folks who haven't traditionally been at the table trying to make sure that they have a meaningful way of participating in the decisions that affect them. And a lot more work to do. So.
Questions?
Thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to talk with all of us. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the constraints operating the school. Because like you said, the FDIC is traditionally made up of economic regulators. I know that in a lot of cases, there's a state law judge that makes a ruling, that informs your decisions. And you can only make decisions based off of evidence that people who intervene in the case can, have presented. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of operating with these ideals of, trying to promote sustainability in clean energy in Michigan while also operating under some very real constraints.
Yeah, it's, way more about the commission than I did probably when I joined the commission, but it's real. And so we are sort of quasi judicial, and like a court, we don't get to just sort of look at sort of any information that we might want to look at, but we are constrained by the statute and then the evidence presented on the record that's then subject to cross-examination and sort of the process of testing which evidence is best. And that's deeply frustrating for a lot of people, including a lot of members of the public who regularly push us to do public comment hearings, and we have tried to do those. The reality, and we say this explicitly, is I cannot base a decision on a sort of issue in the case on a comment that I hear at a hearing, because it's not subject to the same sort of standards of evidence and everything else. I think it helps. It informs how I sort of look at the issues, and I mean, there's a lot of benefit, but it is. So that's one constraint, is that it really does have to be based on the evidence in the case. And we have a pretty robust group of intervening parties in our larger cases. When you go back 10 years and look at the number of parties intervening in a DTE electric rate case, for example, it's about half of what it is today. The number of issues is about half. The number of pages of testimony is about half. And so we often have a pretty robust evidentiary record, and including a lot of groups and a lot of issues that have never been part of our consideration. So some of the Detroit area advocacy organizations, as they're sort of grouped together, but Solidarity and We Want Green Too and others are now formal interveners and they're raising issues around equity and affordability that often have sort of not been central to rate case deliberations, and that's a good thing. Sometimes literally the only party in our case is our staff, and they provide sort of independent testimony, and they are essential because they are often the only ones that show up. But there are times, I will say candidly, that in our deliberations on contested issues, we wished we had a little more on the record to choose from. And sometimes it's all or nothing in terms of a particular issue. And so that, I think, is just one of the, and sometimes we have a sense of like the right answer, and then but that's not on the record. And so it's that, I think. And then the last thing that I'll say is, we are limited by the powers that are given to us, and yet there's an acknowledgement that every decision that we make, particularly in the energy space, has these broader sort of impacts. There are questions around, so before the legislation, I'm not sure how I would have been able to evaluate a proposal from a utility to build a gas plant that had carbon capture and sequestration and was going to permanently store the carbon, and that cost 10% more than an unabated sort of run-of-the-mill gas plant. Like, I understand all those benefits, but those are not benefits that I can sort of quantify. And so we've looked at, can you frame it in terms of risk? Can you frame it in terms of sort of the ultimate, that these are costs that might result in stranded assets to customers later on, and that sort of fit into that sort of traditional economic regulator role. And we do that all the time. And there are times that we say in cases, look, we don't dispute the benefits, but these are not benefits that we can look at from a statutory standpoint. And so if you're going to recover the additional costs for responsibly sourced gas, for example, you need to tell that story utility in a way that sort of lines up with benefits that we're able to consider as we review that particular case. And so those are just sort of realities of what we do, and until the legislature ultimately changes the law, that's the box that we live in. So we can do a lot in that box, but we can't do everything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good question. Other questions? Sure. Sorry. We go back. No.
Oh, okay, you can choose a question about University of Michigan or a question about rates.
Yeah.
Which, two.
Either one.
I'm gonna ask the first one I guess. I know you are a proud Wolverine.
Yeah.
I am wondering what we as a university community can do to help you or help the state of Michigan more broadly advance our goals, either in our research, teaching, or in our service.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, my dad got his master's in music here. I grew up rooting for Michigan. And on the commission, so we live in a building virtual building full of Spartans. But Catherine Peritic has both an undergraduate and a master's degree in engineering from Michigan, and Alessandra Carrion, the third commissioner, got her business degree from the Ross School. So we're all Wolverines, and the rest of our staff hates us. So it's a great thing. So I think Michigan does a number of things that are really important. So first of all, in some of the places where I sort of geek out the most are like, what is happening in the technology space that might be part of our solution set in 2050, that might be commercialized in the 2030s, but is in the labs today. And that has been learning some of the pioneering research and the paths to commercialization and the barriers, I think, has been really, really helpful in understanding, sort of getting outside of like the specifics of a docketed proceeding and understanding what the world may look like in 2050 based on what's being sort of developed here in Ann Arbor today. And I love those trips because it's a different conversation than I often have, but it's eye-opening in terms of, okay, there's things, I mean, and it's not just Michigan, but I think Michigan as sort of a globally leading research institution plays a major role in that. I think some of the work that's ongoing right now in sort of reaching out to the city of Detroit, I think is helpful in understanding and modeling sort of how we in state government might think about it. It's amazing how many people very, very rarely go to our largest city. And I think that's changing. But having grown up here, and I didn't come from the metro area. I was born in Grand Rapids. I grew up in the middle of the state. But I think that sort of the relationship between U of M and the city of Detroit and the sort of outreach, I think, can both provide a model and also a place that we can sort of partner and say, okay, how do we help your efforts there, and then how does that presence ultimately help us in reaching all of Michigan as well? I think those are a couple of the things. There's probably more if I thought about it more. So.
Okay, go back to James. Nobody else has questions. Oh, Steve's hand's going up.
So thanks for your talk. We have some burden. Then we heard a lot of stuff. You look out there on the wall, it's a Dan Scripps skate rep. We have left there a couple of minutes.
Yeah, that's the best use for it.
I'm curious about the organizational change of the utilities. Basically, what you've seen in terms of what's motivating in the past, steroids, and across.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see. So I'll start with reliability and then I'll get to some of the sort of mitigation pieces. So to take a step back, they were vertically integrated for the first 100 years of their existence. And then in 2000, we restructured our energy market in the way that a lot of states did and allowed customers to shop, to choose. And so you still had your relationship with the folks that ran the wire from the pole to your house, but now you could choose sort of among sort of the people who were generating electricity. We did not at that time require them to sell off their generation assets. We actually required them to sell off their transmission assets, the sort of bulk power system in the middle of the donut, but they could still keep their generation assets. They just had to compete against others in the marketplace. And I think that, and there's a reason I'm telling the story, that I think combined with the economic downturn in Michigan starting at about the same time, meant that I think that they essentially used a lot of the revenue that they got from their customers to prop up the competitiveness of their generating assets and wildly disinvested in the grid. And I think we are continuing to pay the price for that today. I think they're better today, and I think we've got their attention. And then they were able to re-regulate 90% of it. They got 90% of their monopoly back in 2008. And but I think that decade of, you can get away with that for a year or two, but you can't get away with it for a decade. And I think some of the outage performance that we're seeing today is largely because they were forced to compete with others, and to make themselves more competitive for a decade, they essentially were robbing out of their distribution systems. I think one of the advantages of having single state utilities, and there are disadvantages too, but one of the advantages is they're a little more sensitive to the regulatory environment, and having the same basic approach for the last 6 years, and I will say for probably about the last 15 years, because Rick Snyder, I think, had a very similar approach. The people that he appointed were, I think, really strong, and a number of the folks, particularly in the last years of the Granholm administration, I think started the journey that we're still on. But having that continuity, even across differences in executive leadership in the state, and having single state utilities that sort of were more focused on that, I think they have managed the energy transition faster than in a lot of places, and have been more aligned from sort of a directional standpoint with where the state was going than you've seen with utilities that are sort of getting maybe mixed messages from Indiana and Michigan, or across sort of a broader footprint that includes multiple states. And I think that's been ultimately to the good in making the transition, retiring some of the older, more expensive and dirtier assets, and replacing them with a larger share of both sort of demand side resources and renewables. There's one more thing I wanted to say, but that's probably, yeah, if I think of it, I'll come back. They are different. Consumers, I think for the last number of, they have been good at telling their story. And I think they, particularly under their past CEO, Patty Poppy, who went off to PG&E in California, but continued under their current CEO, I think they've been good at, I remembered the other thing, they've been good at telling their story. DTE sometimes, operationally, you sort of, okay, I understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, but it's, and sometimes it's, you don't get the same sort of, I'm trying to think of the right words. I'm not trying to be disparaging of either company at this point, but the sort of polish that you sometimes get from consumers. The last thing that I'll say is they both continue to be both gas and electric companies, and that is challenging in a lot of ways. So about 75% of their revenue comes from their electric companies, but their gas companies are sort of, they're almost like traditional utilities, from like, they just leave them alone and they make them money. And the investments are long-term, but in terms of electrification or making that additional, and they operate in overlapping territories. So the gas service that you often receive will be consumers, even if it's DTE electric service, and vice versa. And so you get a sense that there's almost sort of mutually assured destruction and détente going on, where I'm not going to poach your gas customers and try and electrify them on my system, even though that's where 75% of my revenue comes from, because I don't want you doing that to my gas customers. And I think the legislation takes some steps. It allows for the filing of efficient electrification plans. It requires a little bit more in terms of planning and studying. It doesn't require them to do something that at this point they haven't shown a whole lot of interest in doing. And so that seems to me to be one of the big challenges that we're going to wrestle with over the next decade.
Great example of why policy matters. Okay, one more question? One more question?
Right, James.
Anybody? Sure, go ahead. Yep.
So I know you mentioned earlier that some of your staff members at the NPIC are, engineers or more focused on comments. Can you just talk a little bit about, like, is that generally like students do?
Yeah, it has been. I think that is actually changing. That with the planning functions, there's still a role for economists and engineers certainly, but we're getting a lot more analysts and generalists who I think have been really additive to that. And we're currently hiring for a number of positions. We're currently in the section on renewable energy and energy storage siting. And one of the people that we're in the process of making an offer to has a pretty good land use background. And so some of these places that we have not typically needed that level of expertise, we're starting to sort of actively recruit for it. And I think I think it's helpful both in doing the new functions, but I think honestly that these considerations are sort of increasingly core to how we think about the energy system more broadly, even sort of the regular stuff that we've long done. And but I think it's been helpful in increasing that. And I'll also say we have been, I think, good at finding both entry level and senior level folks to do specific things. We recently, for example, the last couple of years, it's not a new hire, but we hired one of the people who was running the Salvation Army's assistance programs, and she now is the assistant to the director of the customer assistance division. And so thinking about from a programmatic and policy standpoint, how these programs work, she's been absolutely instrumental. But also getting some sort of early career people with unique and diverse backgrounds. We've got a young economist from Michigan State who just came in, but his focus, he's in the process of getting his PhD, but his focus is around sort of broader system economics as opposed to sort of particular investments. And that, I think, again, from like an equity and some of the broader social questions that we're facing has been helpful and additive to the skill set that we already had. There's a place for everybody.
There's a place for everyone in state government. All right, with that, Dan, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy calendar. And I took a ton of notes, as I usually do. Really grateful. And everybody, please join me in thanking him for taking time. Well, I let you go. Just a reminder, October 22nd, we'll have Kara Cook here. So thanks again for participating. And those of you in the room, please take bagels on the way out. So thanks again.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I actually kind of fun. I should think about it last year.